She was a beautiful ship. She looked so lovely. That's how we ought to remember her.
That bridge was going to happen.
The Emperor Norton may have been crazy, but he saw the future in a tie between the growing city of San Francisco on the south and the wide-open lands to the north. Time was, Marin County seemed a world away from San Francisco. From the perspective of the big city, it was a beautiful place to visit for Sunday outings. But if you wanted to move across the bay in those days, you had one way to go: ferry boats. It wasn't a bad way either, though things sometimes got impossibly crowded.
We used to take the ferry, the automobile ferry, would take us over to Marin County, and then we'd pick up and go wherever we wanted. And it was a pain in the neck. I don't want to use that kind of a phrase, but automobiles would line up on all the various streets that led to the dock that was over near Fisherman's Wharf, and you would struggle along to get on one. You must have wanted it badly to go over there in that mess.
The boats themselves offered a pleasant enough diversion.
Yes, the ferry boats were a blessing. They were a break in the day. It was something like a half-hour ride. There was a nice restaurant there. You could meet with your friends and talk. And when I saw that bridge going up, I began to wonder how it's going to change people's lives from a beautiful break in the day to getting there as fast as you can, both ways.
But by the 1920s, with more and more people commuting every day, a bridge seemed inevitable. It was a series of newspaper columns early in this century by a commuter from Marin, James Wilkins, that got the region thinking hard about a bridge. And back in 1917, a little-known bridge builder from Chicago had become so obsessed with the idea, it became his life work, and eventually he would become the bridge's chief engineer.
By all accounts, Joseph Strauss was a small man with big ideas and a rather impatient temperament. He was a dreamer and a bit of a poet and an engineer with a pretty good credential.
But Joseph Strauss had never built anything remotely as ambitious as the Golden Gate. There was opposition to a bridge, of course. Generations of Californians had come to love the beauty of the Golden Inlet, and there were many who saw in a bridge across it the end of that beauty. That is one reason any bridge there had to be spectacular. The engineers who designed it knew they could do no less. And to make the pressure even greater, there was a historic site, the Civil War-era Fort Point, smack in the way of the bridge on the San Francisco side. Joseph Strauss would have to build around it. Today, the juxtaposition of the little fort and the great structure remains one of the bridge's most appealing features. One of Strauss's great skills was appointing the best men for the engineering job he was overseeing. It would be said later that credit for the unbelievably sophisticated engineering involved belonged to his assistant, Charles Ellis, whom he fought with and fired before the actual construction work began, and also to his partner, Clifford Payne. But it is Strauss who was unquestionably in charge of the operation and who is celebrated today as the bridge's master builder. Strauss first proposed a combination suspension and cantilever bridge. At the time, 1921, a pure suspension bridge with a center span of over 4,000 feet seemed impossible. But many San Franciscans had the same reaction. This was a truly ugly structure. Fortunately, in the next 10 years, it was determined a suspension bridge with a more than 4,000-foot center span was possible, and was what Strauss then proposed. But this bridge would have to include major advances over any built before. For such a bridge, besides its unheard-of span, the towers would have to be gigantic, higher than any ever built. One tower would have to rest on a pier built right in the channel, where the winds and tides were overwhelming. And the whole thing would have to be earthquake-proof. Men would die building this bridge. They always did, because so much of the work would be so dangerous. In fact, for this $35 million bridge, it was assumed 35 men would die. A man per million was the rule of thumb. And this would all have to be done in a day when structures were still built largely by hand.
Well, I think just envision, if you can, building a structure of this magnitude with hand labor. We didn't have, as we know today, all of the construction equipment that we normally build major projects out of. And you actually wheelbarrow cement out, and you actually walked out with materials and building materials. And you literally hand-built cranes in place to do some of the heavy lifting.
Getting the bridge underway took years, in part because it was going to be paid for not by the federal government or the state, but by private money, bonds guaranteed by local taxes. Remarkably, in 1930, with a depression underway, the citizens of San Francisco and 6 northern counties agreed to the plan.
And the people went to the polls, and they voted to put up their homes, their farms, their agricultural lands, their commercial properties as a guarantee against a bond issue. Should ever there be a default on the bonds, they would pay it out of the property tax. And I submit again, I doubt many of us would put our houses in hock for a project that many people said would be going to fall in the bay anyway.
And today, the bridge stands as one of the very few monumental feats of American engineering, paid for without any state or federal funds. Of course, nothing about San Francisco had ever been ordinary. It had survived a devastating earthquake in 1906 and was now one of America's great cities. But as in so much of this country, the Depression of the 1930s brought despair to this otherwise spirited place.
Catastrophic. It was terrible. The worst thing I ever saw. I got out of high school in 1933, and there were no jobs to be held. And the thing was worse, when you met some of your friends, you never said hello. It was always a perennial question, have you got a job? Did you find anything like that? And we never did.
So part of the bridge's appeal was the work it promised, maybe even massive amounts of it, and the bridge itself would be undeniably beautiful.
It's just incredible when you think of it. There are just 2 towers holding up what is not unlike a clothesline, anchored at each end, and the bridge itself is hung from that line. And it's a very light-looking design. It's a very graceful design.
In a suspension bridge, a roadway is suspended from cables anchored at each end and draped over 2 towers that support both the cables and the load they will hold up. The natural sag of a cable strong enough to hold the load over the distance determines its shape. But the elegance of a suspension bridge is that the nearly vertical run of the cables on either sides of the tower allows the towers to shoulder the load directly. The construction of the Golden Gate would be divided basically into 5 parts. The anchorages to hold the ends of the cables, the piers to support the towers to hold up the cables, the 2 cables to support the roadway, and finally, the roadway itself.
The assembled multitudes greet the famous 30th Regiment United States.
And after all the talk and all the politics, the big project got underway, as such projects do, with a ceremony of turning over a spadeful of earth.
Mayor Rossi begins the actual groundbreaking ceremonies by turning the first shovelful of earth.
Construction of the bridge had begun. Of the anchorages, the massive concrete housings sunk deep in the ground that would hold the 2 mighty cables. Because hundreds of thousands of tons of concrete would be needed for the bridge anchorages and for the piers beneath the towers, cement mixing plants were built on each shore. Then, a very special concrete was mixed here, made from the millions of ages-old oyster shells found at the bottom of San Francisco Bay. Excavation for the anchorages began in January of 1933 with explosives and power shovels cutting deep into the rock. The finished 12-story building. A maze of wooden scaffolding grows to hold the forms for the incoming concrete. Huge base blocks are built first. At their rear are upright steel anchor chain girders. The steel links called I-bars that will hold the individual strands of the big cables will be attached to these. When the I-bars are in place, the anchor block is poured, burying them up to their necks. The reason there are so many is a key element in the bridge's construction. Although each of the 2 main bridge cables seems like a single piece, it is actually made up of 61 strands of wire, and each strand contains hundreds of pencil-thin wires bundled together. At the anchorage site, each main cable will be divided back up into its 61 parts to spread the load, and it is these 61 huge steel anchors that will hold them. Finally, above the anchor block is added a weight block to add more downward pressure. At its completion, each anchorage can easily hold the 63 million pounds of pull of the cable, the equal of 1,000 steam locomotives. And now, the focus shifts to the mighty piers that will soon hold the bridge's giant and distinctive towers. As complicated as building the Golden Gate Bridge would be, the engineers lucked out in at least one area. The northern pier that would hold the tower on the Marin side could be built on solid rock that extended out from the Marin cliffs. That bedrock is 20 feet beneath the waterline. But building a pier at the site was still a relatively easy job. So that the actual pier supporting the tower could be built on dry land, it was decided that a three-sided dam called a coffer dam would first be fitted snug against the rock. This would later be emptied of water and the tower pier built in dry conditions inside it. The coffer dam has sheet steel plates on its outside edges. To make them watertight, their seams are caulked at first with sacks of wheat. Later, red dirt from the surrounding hillsides will be used. Now the three-sided dam and the side of the cliff form a perfect huge box. Water is pumped from the inside, giving the workmen a field day as they collect the suddenly surprised and very dry fish. And after the rock bed is prepared, successive layers of concrete form the pier itself. Before long, a 65-foot-high monolith stands ready to receive its tower. The great challenge of the Golden Gate Bridge was the South Pier. This would hold up the tower on the San Francisco side, and the basic pier construction would match what had just been fairly easily accomplished on the Marin side. The problem was, this pier was going to have to be plunked down square in the channel, where the tremendous tides and currents and winds made it difficult just to be out there, much less build a structure 60 feet down. And access wasn't the only problem. The seabed on which the pier would sit was not flat, but sloped from 60 to 80 feet below water level. The first work on the South Pier began in early 1933, with a long trestle to provide access to the site, since it was clear the seas were far too rough to work from stationary barges. It takes brave men to work from the barges when they have to be used. They rise and fall like a bucking bronco. Which is not to say the trestle plan doesn't have its own drawbacks. Within months, the trestle is rammed by a very off-course freighter and destroyed, then carefully rebuilt, then destroyed again by a furious storm 2 months later.
It looked there for a while like the conditions weren't going to let this pier be built. I mean, it looked, as soon as they got ready to go, something else would happen. It was almost like they were dues to pay, or before nature would say, okay, go for it.
But the engineers of the Golden Gate are nothing if not adaptable, so they then build a brand new and much stronger trestle. At its end, the plan is to construct a permanent fender of concrete to protect the pier on which the tower will sit. While the trestle is being constructed, excavation of the seabed on which the pier will sit is carried on. This is brilliant but very dangerous explosives work. First, drill bits are dropped down tubes to make indentations in the solid bedrock. Then small bombs are dropped to expand the pilot holes. It takes about 15 of these to do the job. Then, larger bombs are placed into the expanded holes. When a group of the bombs are in place, the deep-sea divers in full Jules Verne regalia attach the wires to them. Then, from the barge Ajax at the surface, the bombs are detonated. With a huge explosion that appears as little more than a big ripple on the surface. And then the debris is removed and the whole process starts again. When the seabed is blasted flat, the building of the fender begins. The fender walls themselves are now built up in an elliptical formation. Concrete forms are lowered into place. The concrete is poured, and the fender grows outward from the trestle. The plan at this point is to sink a caisson at the pier site within the fender. This will become the pier's base. Caissons had been the standard way of working on the sea bottom since the days of the Brooklyn Bridge back in the 1880s. The caisson, essentially a large open-bottomed box, would be towed to the site and sunk to the bottom. Now, compressed air would keep out the water, and the men could then work inside on preparing the sea floor. Caisson work was awful and very frequently deadly. The sand hogs, as the men were called, had to pass through an elaborate airlock so that their bodies could adjust to the different pressure at the surface and below. When the process failed, men died. When work on the seafloor was finished, the men would vacate the caisson, and it would be filled with concrete to become the permanent base of the pier. On the 8th of October, 1934, the steel caisson is brought into the fender. But soon a huge storm blows up, and the caisson starts banging around like a Brahma bull at the rodeo, knocking all hell out of the fender. Joseph Strauss makes a major decision. He will forego the caisson altogether, tow it out of there, enclose the fender, and then, as at the Marin Pier, remove the water and simply work inside in the dry. Now the inside of the fender, still underwater, is filled to 65 feet from the bottom with concrete before the dewatering takes place. Inside the giant fender, the pier grows quickly until the 5-inch thick steel plates on which the tower will sit are put in place, attached to the steelwork buried deep in the pier's concrete. Throughout the drama of the South Pier's construction, tower work has been going on the Marin side. Soon, the skeleton of the Great Bridge will rise above San Francisco Bay. The focal points of the bridge are its great towers, and work began on the Marin side tower in the fall of 1933. Bethlehem Steel of Pennsylvania is given the job of making the steel for the towers. It is a mammoth job that has to be done with exquisite precision. Every rivet hole in the thousands of pieces in the 44,000-ton towers must match up perfectly 3,000 miles away at the building site. The whole thing has to fit together like a giant erector set.
It takes miles of railroad cars to carry the steel for the towers and suspended spans.
As large as the towers are, the pieces must be manageable enough in size to ship them to the Atlantic coastline and then by Bethlehem's own ships through the Panama Canal to San Francisco Bay. And they must be small enough to be handled by the men who will assemble them, because again, this is still very much an era of hand labor. The goal in the towers is to make them enormously strong, of course, but also light enough for the piers to support them. They must also be flexible enough to provide give in the tremendous winds of the gate and to adjust to the varying loads the roadway will have to support. When finished, the towers will be able to bend inward and outward more than 1.5 feet. To do all this, the towers are constructed with hollow cells like a beehive. Men can enter each cell through tiny doorways and manholes to rivet from inside. But they also can and do get lost in the dark and claustrophobic chambers, sometimes for hours at a time.
Oh, it's terribly dark. All dark in there. No daylight, no nothing, you know. See, I got lost one time in there myself. No, that's the only time I got scared a little bit.
Conditions outside the towers are no better.
When the workers built this bridge, they talk about the cold in ways that they may not talk about if they were building a bridge in the east coast of the United States. The cold in this area is the kind that gets in under your sweaters. There's no garment that seems to be able to keep it away from you because it's wet. It's wet cold, and it just sits there.
Oh, the gate, that was the coldest place I think I ever worked. You worked like everything to keep warm, and you'd put on all the clothes that you'd put in your I mean, there you felt it bad.
And in these conditions, death is always just one misstep away.
Well, you knew if you messed up, you probably wouldn't live long, or one of your buddies wouldn't, and you didn't want that hanging on you, so you thought about it, and was careful.
Who are the bridge workers, these men who risk their lives every day?
They were adventurers, mostly. It's not a job that everybody would take to. Working at heights when the wind is blowing takes a tremendous amount of agility and confidence and a certain amount of daringness.
Rough, toughest guys in the world. Fight all the time. Fight each other. Roll each other. I don't know, your heart beats faster. You're a different guy up there.
Well, they were kind of guys I've never met before. They were sort of a closely knit clan that they all knew one another from previous jobs. They'd done bridges all over the world, and a lot of what they did seemed very scary to me.
In spite of any dangers, slowly the towers ascend.
As the year 1933 unfolds, the Marin Tower climbs toward the roadway level. Even in this early stage, there appears the beauty of line that will make the Golden Gate Bridge famous.
Because it is obviously impossible to plant cranes in the seabed or mount them on barges in the turbulent sea, a unique method of self-lifting cranes is devised. As each section of tower is completed, the giant cranes lift themselves to a higher level to start the next section.
One red-hot rivet coming up, special delivery to men working by the light of miners' lamps inside the tower.
Things move swiftly, but a safety problem arises early in tower construction.
A lot of riveters were coming down with otherwise unexplained ailments. At one point, they had 60 people in the infirmary diagnosed with appendicitis. Hair was falling out and nausea. And they finally realized that when the steel was coming west from Bethlehem, that it had been treated with red lead paint in such a way that the rivet holes had a membrane of paint covering it. And when those rivets hit the red lead, it was creating a fume.
The problem is solved by sending air into the closed tower cells and by supplying the men with filtration masks, though many refuse to wear them. Later on, the steel will be protected by iron oxide instead of the red lead during its manufacture. The work on the bridge is clearly tough and dangerous, but the Depression has changed the whole equation of labor and management. The bridge was undertaken in part because it promised jobs in these terrible times, but it can never hope to make more than a dent in the unemployment problem. And every day at the bridge site, those leaving work can see armies of desperate men looking for work on the bridge.
I was up there, 150 guys down the bottom of the tower waiting for us to fall off or quit so they can get the job. They come from all over the United States here. It makes you a little nervous, you know, because I know what he's down there for. Hell, they get these 5-gallon tins, they were cooking beans and bacon butts. You could smell that stuff coming up there. They had fires there all day long. 4 o'clock, they'd leave. In the morning, they were there to get ahead of us.
This ready supply of labor emboldens the contractors to push their men to work harder and faster. Speed increases profits.
And the expression they had those days was 8 for 8 or out the gate, meaning you put in 8 hours for your 8 hours of pay, you put in 8 hours of work according to your supervisor's satisfaction, or he would look over to this fence at all the people who were waiting for jobs who didn't have them. He'd fire you and get one of them.
At that time, they would say, you moved or else you didn't stay. No, many a time I see a foreman come out there at 9 o'clock to see a guy, you know, he wasn't doing it like he should do, and go get you a check.
The Marinside Tower goes up first, but both towers are finished by the middle of 1935. Now, the Bay Area can get a good look at what it has agreed to, for it is the towers that define the look of the entire structure. And few cannot be impressed. Pulling from the best of the Art Deco design of the period, the engineers and architects have built 2 simple and majestic forms. As their subtle geometric lines play with the ever-changing light, the bridge itself constantly changes its appearance. The horizontal plates that cover the structural steel above the roadway turn the towers into giant, inviting doorways. And where it is usual to increase in size the details in a structure as it climbs to keep them visible from ground level, the designers here do the opposite, simplifying and thinning the towers as they ascend so that they seem to reach like steeples into the sky. During construction, the question of the bridge's final color has been hotly debated. Protecting the bridge from the elements is the key requirement. Suggestions have run to the usual black, silver, or gray. But a color called Dulux International Orange has stood up well in tests and matches closely the original protective paint, which people have come to like. It contrasts with the cool blue-grays of sea and sky. And it also matches the rust-colored earth of the Marin Hills. 7 months before completion, the decision is made, and it will never be regretted. The towers now stand as sentinels of the Golden Gate. Next will come the most intricate part of the job, and the part that defines a suspension bridge: the spinning of the 2 giant cables that will hold up the roadway. The bridge is its cabling, the 2 huge cables knitted from thousands of tiny wires which hold up everything, the hundreds of thousands of tons of roadway and cars and trucks and people. It was in the spectacular achievement of the Brooklyn Bridge back in the early 1880s that the engineers John and his son Washington Roebling had made their reputation. Here, wire made from steel was used in the cables for the first time. It is their wire steel firm, the Roebling Company, that has been hired to do the enormously sophisticated cabling work on the Golden Gate. From their base back east, the Roebling Company has sent out the engineers and materials to do the job. The cabling process begins with the arrival from the east of the coils of the pencil-thin wire. When the bridge is completed, each of the 2 cables will have over 27,000 of these wires in it. But because they're attached at their ends, each cable will, in fact, contain just 1 wire 40,000 miles long. It could circle the Earth nearly 2 times. The coils of wire are uncoiled and joined together at their ends into larger coils under tremendous pressure. Then the wires are cleaned of the wax that has been protecting them since manufacture. Now, the wire on the intermediate length wheels is rolled onto the final huge spools, which will be taken to the bridge site for unreeling into the cable. Just as elaborate temporary scaffolding is necessary for workers to reach all parts of a new building, placing the 2 cables requires long footbridges to be first built from shore to shore so workers can reach every part of them. The footbridges are to be laid on wire ropes, and with the pulling across of the first one, the 2 sides of the Golden Gate will be connected for the first time in history. The Coast Guard stops all ship traffic through the gate as these ropes are towed across and hung from the towers. The footbridges themselves are made up of 10-foot sections of redwood planks on steel. 10 of these make up what is called a train, and these are then slid down the wire ropes into position. Crosspieces help steady them and serve as bridges from one to the other. When finished, The two footbridges match the arc of the yet-to-be-spun cables, and it looks almost as if the bridge is nearly finished. But the real cabling operation hasn't even begun. What is going on, basically, in the cabling operation is the pulling of the wire from one shore to the other to build up the two cables that hold up the roadway. Hundreds of wires make up what is called a strand. And again, there are 61 strands packed into each cable. After the beginning of each new roll has been attached to the end of the wire already in place, a loop made up of the fixed and new wire is placed around a wheel attached to what is called a tramway carriage and pulled to the other side. At first, only two wheels are used, but in these depression times, the Roebling Company has had to submit a rock-bottom bid to get the contract for the work. And at this slow rate of cabling, they'll lose their shirt. Well, if two wheels work on each tramway, why not three? And before long, the bridge towers begin to look like the largest telephone poles ever built. Through a system of weights and pulleys, workers keep the tension on the unrolling wire constant. At the opposite shore, each loop is placed around a horseshoe-shaped fixture called a strand shoe, connected to one of the eye-bars buried deep in the anchorage. Each of the 61 strands is attached to a different eye-bar to spread the force of the cable's pull. When a strand is finished, the strand shoe is brought back into the eye-bar, and then, like so many Lilliputians out of Gulliver, workmen lock it in place with a huge pin, using nothing but their own strength. Working high up in the sky, other men ready the wires to be placed in the saddles which carry the cables over the towers. At the end of the process, when all 61 strands are in place, this hexagon is compacted into a perfectly round shape by one very powerful machine. The cables were spun in record time, just 6 months. The Roebling Company and its men held a party that lasted 3 days. And now, the work on what everything done so far was designed to hold up, the roadway, was ready to begin. In building the Golden Gate is hanging the roadway from the cables. To do that, cable bands are placed around the cable, and steel wire ropes, called for obvious reasons suspender ropes, are dropped around them into position. The Golden Gate is, again, not a rigid structure, but a flexible one, designed so that all its parts will be held in perfect alignment. If the suspender ropes should stretch from the load of cars and trucks, the roadway would not sit at the right height. So they are pre-stressed at the factory to limit their stretch. Like so much else on the Golden Gate, the suspender ropes are placed as much by the power of man as by machine. Now the roadway structure is ready to go. And now it's also time for Bethlehem Steel to get back into the game. They've custom manufactured all the pieces back east and sent them out here for placement. This work is a lot like the tower work. Like ants, the men crawl over, under, and around the steel to rivet it in place. That means for some men, spending hours working in the dark inside box girders, hours filled with unbelievable noise and smells and vibration. The side pieces of the roadway are called stiffening trusses. and they're made up of bottom and top pieces called chords and connecting verticals and diagonals. The roadway structure is a grid system made up of huge cross beams topped by long steel stringers. On top of this will be placed a grid of reinforcing steel, and then the concrete roadway itself will be poured. With all the dangerous work on the bridge, injury and death is to be expected. But the fact that at a time when it's assumed one man will die for every $1 million spent, only 11 men will die on this $35 million bridge is a tribute to the chief engineer and his obsession with safety.
One remarkable feature of the bridge is that it was built at such speed with so few casualties. And that didn't come by accident. Strauss's firm, and the record suggests it was Strauss himself, was preoccupied with the notion of safety.
Well, they were safety. If you were, it looked like it was dangerous, the foreman or superintendent saw that you wasn't handling things right and everything like that, you were out.
The Golden Gate is the first bridge to require safety helmets. And there is a remarkable innovation here. A safety net that runs under the growing roadway.
One fella, he fell about 35, 40 feet, but the net caught him and he come out and he wasn't hurt. That net made it a lot different there. It turned you loose and let you work free and easy.
The 19 men who cheat death by falling into the net instead of the bay later start what they call the Halfway to Hell Club. It was named by a man who had a particularly nasty accident. Al Zampa, now 92 years old, worked steel on the roadway 140 feet above the channel. One day, he took a misstep and fell into the net.
See, I stepped too far, hit on my heel, slipped that quick down, hit the net.
Unfortunately, the net at that point was hanging over some rocks on the Marin side.
I wasn't scared because I figured the net's going to catch me. It never did catch me. It caught me in the ground at the same time.
He was carrying 30 pounds of very hard, sharp tools on his belt. He broke 4 vertebrae and spent 3 months in the hospital.
All my friends that came out said, you're going to be selling pencil now. You'll lose your nerve. You won't be able to do it anymore. I said, oh, yes, I can.
But it was 6 long years before Al Zampa was a bridge worker again.
By fall of 1936, residents of San Francisco are treated to the sight of a span which moves steadily closer to the day when the two halves will meet.
The final and joining piece of steel in the middle of the Golden Gate is placed on the afternoon of November 18, 1936. The timing is no accident. The engineering of the Golden Gate is so precise that after thousands of pieces of steel and thousands of tons of concrete have been placed, this last piece is designed to fit only after the sun has warmed the steel sufficiently to expand it. Only then will all the holes line up perfectly. Although the big cables are in place before the roadway is hung, they now receive one more treatment. To protect their thousands of wires from the elements and to help hold the wires in position, the cables are wrapped with steel wire. This requires a special machine mounted directly on the cable. When finished and painted, the cable looks so smooth that most people assume it is made of just one very long and large piece of curved metal. The work is nearly done now, and the bridge is rushing to completion with its amazing safety record intact. And then, on February 17th of 1937, as if to prove every bridge demands its human toll, the luck runs out. Teams of men have been assigned to remove concrete forms from underneath the roadway. All at once, the support on one of the hanging platforms holding 12 men gives way. Briefly, the safety net holds, but the weight is too much. The noise of the popping net tells everyone it is too late.
The tides caught the net and started pulling it, pulled it taut for a while, almost as though it were a slide. One of the workers tried running up it, literally running back up it toward, but eventually it broke off and carried him in.
So we saw the whole thing, and we were throwing debris over for anybody that might still be alive and able to, and needed a little bit of help, grab onto a piece of wood or a piece of scaffolding or something like that.
When all the racket and everything, when that fell and tore down, I turned and looked, and over here about 10, 15 feet, or 20 feet from me, just on the other side, was two men, hold of it like that, the flanges of beams just hanging there with nothing under them. Everything went down, and 10 of them they never found, you see. There was a 5-mile tide going out. And no, we couldn't see them at all. And I knew all of them. We were all working together.
While the Accident Commission holds its hearings, the men return warily to the job. And by April of 1937, as final work is finishing up, San Francisco starts rehearsing its celebrations. The Great Bridge is done, finished under budget and in record time. And now it is time to celebrate. And the hoopla takes a full week, Fiesta Week, when the celebrations take over San Francisco. It's like a second gold rush. The town is teeming with visitors, and there are parades and pageants everywhere. But the biggest events, of course, are the 2-day opening of the bridge itself. And the first, on May 27th, is Pedestrian Day, a day when the walking public, and as it happens, the skipping, roller skating, running, kissing, and hugging public are invited to cross the bridge for the first time. And then, the next day, it is the turn for the automobiles the bridge has been built for. And in slow, steady progression, they begin a motorcade that will become nearly 40 million cars a year long. It's been 60 years now since the Golden Gate Bridge first opened to the public, and the few changes it has required is proof of how well it was built. In 1954, after high winds had forced the bridge to close briefly, new stiffening girders were added underneath the roadway. In 1985, the entire concrete roadway was pulled up and replaced with a new one of steel. Then, for the 50th anniversary, the bridge was opened to pedestrians only, to reenact the earlier Pedestrian Day. So many people crowded on that the bridge took on a new shape as the entire roadway flattened out. But there was no permanent damage. And now a $175 million project will retrofit the bridge to make it more earthquake-proof. Strengthening steel and devices to isolate any movement will be added in various places on the bridge itself and on the approaches. In the short span of 60 years, the Golden Gate Bridge has become a symbol of American engineering and a monument to a time when the big projects were taken on and built right.
I knew, deep down in my heart, I knew it was going to be a great bridge. I knew it.
I think the bridge is something that nobody can ever take for granted, and I don't believe you can say that about many other things. Maybe even in things that couldn't have been done or shouldn't have been done before eventually become commonplace. A bridge is not commonplace, nor will it ever be.
Once, a bridge here seemed an impossibility. Now, it's impossible to think of San Francisco without it. And it's just as impossible to look at this extraordinary structure today and not sense the pride those who built it felt on its completion more than half a century ago.
For today's newest and latest science information, log